Thank everyone for taking the time to be here today. This is our third monthly lecture and discussion series in our Whole Picture Health programming. So for those of you that are new to the conversation, thank you for being here. And for those of you that are returning members, thank you for your interest and your commitment. We started the programming in January, and that began with an introduction to Whole Picture Health and Wellness. That was followed by a February conversation, which was called Back to Basics, in which we explored some of the ways that we can take back some control and some agency in regards to our own health and wellness and physical function status. And so today we're going to delve into the first of our 5 pillars of health and wellness, and we'll be focusing on nutrition and how to recognize and use food as fuel and food as medicine. The objectives for today's conversation are to explore the meaning of food and its role in our day-to-day lives, to examine the way our body uses and relies on energy from food, a little bit of a dive into the biochemistry of food, recognizing the negative consequences of poor eating habits on our health. I'm hoping that through this discussion and information sharing, I can help create increased awareness around food choices and eating habits, to foster learning of the basic practical strategies we can implement to optimize our nutrition pillar, to promote understanding the optimal amount of fiber and protein intake and the rationale behind these recommendations, and to really restore a positive relationship with food and to recognize its vital role as medicine and fuel and an energy source, and rather looking at it as a barrier or something that's detrimental to our health, though it can certainly function in that way. Reframing our relationship and awareness around food so that we can use it for its benefit in the way that nature really intended food to be utilized. So if we think back to our previous discussion and what we know about the status of our health in present day, modern day times, we consider the standard American diet, which is characterized by a great abundance of accessibility and calorie dense, or nutrient poor food. So the standard American diet really evolved under this goal of mass production that's easily accessible, highly palatable, and can be mass reproduced. So you can imagine in undertaking that project, the quality of the food then really suffers as a consequence. So we know additionally that 1 in 3 adults are considered metabolically unhealthy, that 40% of adults are living with obesity, that poor eating habits can contribute directly to diagnoses such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, osteoporosis, and osteoarthritis. Greater than 25% of our energy intake is coming from added sugars in processed foods. And despite a caloric surplus, we are also suffering from a micronutrient deficit diet. When we look at the breakdown in the graphic here of our food consumption, we can see in the yellow that processed food makes up a far greater proportion of the recommended breakdown of nutrients in our diet. So we're looking at a 73% makeup of processed foods, and that includes added fats, oils, sugars, and refined grains. So as we start this exploration, and we really start to develop increased awareness, both about food in general, about our own personal eating habits, and then recognizing where we can make some meaningful changes, it's important to consider, at its most basic level, what does food mean to each of us individually? So I'll invite you to just take a minute and reflect on that question. If you think about food, what are some of the first things that come up? Do you have a visual of the foods that you tend to gravitate towards? Are you somebody that has a love-hate relationship with food? Does food trigger more of a struggle or negative connotations? Maybe you're someone that's been on and off various diets in the past unsuccessfully. So I think I'd be willing to bet that some of the first things that come to mind are not necessarily food as our primary energy source or food in a positive context as something that can really promote healing and health within our body system. What we often think about is the classic standard American makeup of refined sugars, refined carbohydrates, snack items, the things that kind of we are exposed to on a day-to-day basis in the local grocery stores, the things that are easy to grab, highly palatable. Hopefully, on some of our radars, we're picturing something or visualizing something that does promote health, and that's a little bit more nutrient dense and well-rounded in its makeup of protein, healthy carbohydrates, healthy fats, fiber, adequate servings of fruit and vegetables for our polyphenols and antioxidants. I think food can also be thought of and should be recognized as an important contributor to our social environment. It's a way that we can interact with one another. It can be a source of community. It can be a source of sharing some of our own personal history and perhaps some of our heritage in food that's unique to each of our own individual makeups. And so this can be a really positive element of food. We can look at how food and what comprises diets varies depending on where we are in different parts of the world. And some of you may be familiar with the term blue zone or blue zone diets. The blue zones are the areas in the world, I believe at this point there are 7 recognized blue zone regions that people are living the longest and healthiest in comparison to counterparts. So we take, for example, Okinawa, Japan, and the individuals there have longest life expectancy. But in terms of that longevity piece, they're also really functioning in a way with a prolonged health span as well. So unlike here in the United States, where we see that sharp divide or gap in our health span versus our lifespan, so we know from our previous discussion that we're living longer due to medication, due to technology. However, the years, those added years are not necessarily healthy years. So we're really trying in the healthcare realm to bridge that gap where our health span is starting to approximate our lifespan. And then we have kind of that traditional fast food visual, often fast food chains associated with American chains. And then last but not least, we have energy. So probably its most important role, but often the one that falls at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of how we think and visualize and conceptualize food. So if we start to explore what it means to think of food as fuel or food as our primary source of energy, of course, in doing so, we have to take a little bit of a look into the biochemistry and the physiology of our makeup and how these systems are working together. So what we eat dictates then what we produce as a means of energy to our system. And this is both in kind of a macro sense, like how our body operates day to day, just our physical function, our ability to walk from place to place, our energy levels to accomplish our activities of daily living, our exercise routines, our participation in things that bring us joy and meaning. And it also pertains to the micro level of things. So how are our cells functioning at their most basic level? What is the health of our mitochondria and what's happening at a really minute level of function? And it really is amazing the precision and the efficiency at which our body does function on a day-to-day basis. And so why not explore how we can really aid this process and make it as optimal as possible through our consideration of nutrition, and thinking more mindfully about food as our fuel source. So we want to look at how do we use food as energy? What does it mean to explore metabolism? What is our metabolism? And then how does food impact our metabolic health? We discussed some of the concept in our previous conversation about how, much like with our general health status, I think it can be applied to our relationship with food and nutrition as well, but we've become very disconnected from our overall both relationship with our body and with our health, and also our role, that internal locus of control, or somebody that has self-agency in managing some of these things. And we've really given away a lot of our power to external sources, whether that's relying on a multitude of various clinicians to help manage. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all need a strong interdisciplinary team and a support system in place. But it's really happening at a cost of having some of our own agency with some of the lifestyle factors that we do have a real ability to meaningfully change for the better. Um, so along those same lines as being disconnected from our health and our role in our health, we're also very disconnected from our food and from the food choices that we're making. Eating has become a really mindless practice and something that we often hurry through or rush to do because we're hungry. And then we're thinking about what activity or what thing on our to-do list we have to engage in next. So eating becomes more of this kind of passive necessity than an active process with which we're mindfully engaged in. Um, so when we look at the breakdown of the kind of science behind using food as fuel, as many of us can understand and conceptualize, it's a complex process, as is most of our body processes. So in its most simplistic explanation, energy is derived from the food that we intake, from the food and the beverages that we drink. So it's delivered through our body through that intake in the form often of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Digestion, so the process that takes place through our digestive system, through our digestive tract, influenced there by the health of our gut and our microbiome, which is a far more extensive conversation than what tonight we'll explore, but maybe something we revisit in the future. And then from that process, that initial source of energy is then broken down into its substrates, so primarily glucose, which is then converted to what we know as our energy source of ATP. And part of this process is what we recognize as our metabolism. And oftentimes we have kind of a very general understanding of what our metabolism is. And we usually think of it as either we have good metabolism, we have bad metabolism, or we have fast metabolism versus slow metabolism. You may be someone that either your own experience, or you can think of a sibling or a friend where you would describe them as somebody that could eat whatever they wanted and they wouldn't have to worry about any negative ramifications in terms of their body makeup, body composition, or how that food affected them. Where you maybe felt like you could eat one or two things and it would stay with you for weeks on end. And so we often have this, general sense of what our own metabolism is, without really understanding the important role that it plays. And that just like other realms of our health, we do have the ability to affect our metabolism. So we're not destined to have a set metabolism from birth that is then fixed as either fast or slow, good or bad. So metabolism refers to all of the chemical reactions that are taking place within our being, us as a living organism. And the ultimate goal of the metabolic process is to maintain homeostasis and to create an environment at which cells can function as efficiently as possible. It can take on two forms. So we have catabolism, which is the breakdown of food components into their simpler forms. So for example, carbohydrate to glucose, which then can be used as energy. And then we have anabolism, which is the component of our metabolism in which our body uses energy for repair. You may be familiar with this if you're somebody that's undergone surgery or that was hospitalized. Oftentimes, when the body is trying to promote healing and going through a rehabilitation state, protein, for example, will be recommended as something that we really pay close attention to and that we try to get more of because protein, when it's broken down into its amino acids into protein, and then that is utilized for tissue repair. So just to give a little more uh, overview and kind of in-depth understanding that metabolism is a much greater process, an important process than I think what we tend to give it credit to. And as we were describing previously, it begs the question, is metabolism dictated by our nature or through nurture or a combination of both, as many things are? And the science at this point does show in consensus that it is a mechanism of both these things. So there is some genetic component to it. However, it is more a product of the environment and lifestyle choices that we are making. So we have to consider, as we did when we discussed our mismatch hypothesis in terms of our physical activity levels and how modern day life is lending itself to us living a more sedentary lifestyle. And that from an evolutionary standpoint, we haven't evolved in our body systems to be able to handle this level of overconsumption of calories and under expenditure of energy. So the same can be said in regards to our metabolism. We're really existing in this constant state of a calorie surplus. So the quantity of our food intake and also the quality of that food is far less than it was in our hunter-gatherer ancestral times. And then the nature of how society has evolved, post-industrial revolution, modern day work habits. We're spending far greater time sedentary. So whether it's sitting at a workstation, sitting on Zoom meetings, commuting in a car or public transportation. So if we remember, only 24% of the adult population right now is meeting the general physical activity guidelines. And then just a little deeper dive into metabolic rate. So you might ask yourself, okay, if I'm not set genetically with a fast or slow metabolism, what are some ways that really determine what my metabolism is or how well it's functioning? So then we look at what's called our metabolic rate, and we all have a resting metabolic rate. This is comprised of three underlying processes. So we have what's called the basal metabolic rate. That's our resting rate. So without expending energy through exercise, um, our body expends energy just through maintaining its daily existence and all of those minute processes that are taking place minute to minute, second to second. So we have a resting metabolic rate. It's our energy used for our basic day-to-day functions. The most important component of our resting metabolic rate, or what dictates this, is our lean muscle makeup. So even at rest, muscle tissue burns far more calories than adipose tissue. So we can affect our basal or resting metabolic rate by our body composition. Then we have what's called thermogenesis. This is specific to the energy that is used during digestion. During this process, we create heat. The digestive process gives off, like other processes, a byproduct. It generates heat through work, and it causes a temperature increase within our body. When we look at food types and their effect on this thermogenesis process, we know that protein creates a 20 to 30% rise in thermogenesis, whereas refined sugars and carbohydrates would contribute to roughly a 5% increase. So again, if we want to rev up our metabolism, another way would be to be careful and more attentive to our food choices and to make selections that will contribute to a greater metabolic rate as well. And then the last component, which is probably what we think about the most in regards to our metabolism, is our physical activity level. So the energy that's being expended or utilized to participate in some form of physical activity. And that can be strength training, it can be cardio, it's also our day-to-day activity levels, the walking that we do just to accomplish our day-to-day tasks. There is also, which is helpful to think about, what's called the afterburn effect, or EPIC, which is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So the studies have really found that even after your bout of physical activity, and let's say that's a 30-minute or hour session of get up and go, or at your local YMCA, there then will be a continued increased rate of metabolism for a length of time after that designated exercise session. So again, we have our metabolic rate, these three determining factors, all of which are amenable to our choices and our ability to just be more aware and proactive as to how to support them in functioning to the best of our ability and to promote health in an optimal way. And then on the flip side, we can explore what's really a barrier or what's hindering our metabolism. And probably the most prevalent hindrance in American culture, in addition to what we discussed briefly last time and what we will delve into in next month's exercise and physical activity pillar, is ultra-processed food and our diet and nutrition makeup. So ultra-processed food was first added to what's called the NOVA classification system. This is a system of kind of a tiered system of putting food into categories based on how processed they are from their original form. So this fourth category of ultra processed food was added in 2009, and it was done so following exploration of the alarming increase in rates of both type 2 diabetes and obesity. So we started to look at the quality of food and realizing that, okay, this food source has now moved beyond the current classification system to a degree of processing that we need to reflect in a new categorization. Um, the characteristics of ultra processed food, I think the term is something that we are all familiar with and that's used often, but could we all give an explanation or characteristic of what ultra processed food really is? So these food items, they're characterized by a loss of what's called the food matrix, and we will explore this in a future slide. So due to the high degree of processing that takes place, the original food matrix and makeup of the food item is pretty much altered or demolished. They're empty calories, so we're consuming calories that do not provide much in terms of their energy source when they are broken down into their components. They're low in satiety, so they're not keeping us full. We're often then eating handful after handful. We're not triggering that system, our hormonal system that tells our brain that we're satisfied and that we no longer need to consume food. They're often contributing to a hyperglycemic state where we're getting these really sharp spikes postprandial in our blood sugar. And then we have this crash, and so then we have to restabilize by an increased carbohydrate sugar intake, and we get on this really rocky ride throughout our day. And then they contain a multitude of unnatural products, so stabilizers, emulsifiers, and preservatives. And if you think about these items that are often found kind of centralized in our grocery store aisles, they need something to allow them to exist on those shelves for a long period of time. And that's where these fillers are coming in. They're giving these products palatability, they're giving them shelf life, they're keeping them preserved so that we can store and consume them over a longer period of time. And just to give a more explanation about the food matrix. So the food matrix refers to the arrangement of all the components in a food item that then interact with each other to determine characteristics of the food. So its digestibility, its bioavailability as energy, and its nutritional value. So when we think about food in its naturally occurring state, like getting it directly from its source, so maybe that's the apple from the tree, it's created per nature, and this is what nature is so good at doing, in a way that's going to allow it to then be utilized as efficiently and optimally as possible by our biological system. So we have the apple, which is encased in the skin, and it's meant to be consumed that way because the skin is where we have our fiber that then helps balance out the naturally occurring sweetener or sugar within the fruit. So we have this balancing act that's taking place. But when we alter the food matrix and we strip the food of some of its naturally occurring compounds, then we create the way that that food source then interacts and can be utilized by our body system. And this is really where I think we kind of get in trouble with sugar. Um, so when we look at sugar uh, in its form of energy that we break down from our food intake is glucose. And glucose is the primary preferred source of fuel for our brain and our body. So why then, if this is our fuel source, is it so demonized? So it's important to note that it's naturally occurring state, that it's not so bad. But we have to look at the standard American diet has a surplus of what's considered added sugar. So in addition to what's naturally occurring in the food source, we then have an exponential amount of added sugar that we are consuming, oftentimes unconsciously. And that is comprised of sucrose, which is table sugar, fructose, which is an alternate form of sugar that's metabolized in the liver. It's involved heavily in lipogenesis, so converted often to fat. And then we have corn syrup, which is the processed version of added sugar. And this is the sugar that we really want to be aware of. So when we think again of sugar and metabolic function, it's not a bad thing. This sugar was designed to help fuel our system. Glucose is, we would not be able to live without glucose. It's the building block for our energy source and for all of the biological processes. Believe it or not, the brain is our largest consumer of glucose. It uses 20% of all of the glucose-derived energy on a day-to-day basis. So when glucose enters our cells, and it does so via insulin, which is a hormone, it has three outcomes. It's either used immediately for energy, if we have an energy need, which we do at all times. It can be stored as energy, and this then goes back to our ancestral kind of evolutionary genetic makeup to store energy because we didn't have access to food at all times during our hunter-gatherer years. And then it can be determined to be excess. So when we don't need immediate energy, when we have enough energy in storage, then what's left over will be stored as fat. So the goal essentially is to create this match between our energy intake and our energy requirements. However, as we've stated now a number of times, our energy requirements are less and our energy intake is excessive. So we are, all of us on a day-to-day basis, for the most part, in a calorie surplus. So a numerous amount of our glucose intake is then getting converted to fat. And that fat is often getting stored, not ectopically, or as it should be subcutaneously, but it's getting stored in our visceral tissue. So namely around our liver, around our pancreas, and it's then starting to be very detrimental in some of our important functions. So to reiterate, we then look at framing sugar in its role in metabolic dysfunction. So as we just reviewed, we have excess glucose that's then stored as subcutaneous fat. However, we often meet what we all have as our personal fat threshold. And then the fat storage has to migrate somewhere. So instead of being stored subcutaneously, which our body is designed to do with adipose tissue, it then migrates and gets stored as visceral fat. This is one of the leading causes of what we know as insulin resistance. So although our body's producing adequate insulin to get our glucose out of the bloodstream, we start to become insulin resistant, so our body no longer responds to that hormone. And again, this leads to downstream effect of increased glucose in the bloodstream, which has all sorts of negative consequences in terms of how it disrupts um, the tissue, and whether that's in our circulatory system, at a cellular level. So it's really then left unchecked by insulin uptake and use of energy. It's starting to then wreak havoc at a cellular level. So we know that elevated glucose and inflammatory byproduct is associated with disease states like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is rising on a year-to-year basis, type 2 diabetes, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and it's implicated in the rising rates of infertility that we're seeing. In microvasculature disease, so your neuropathies, some of that small vessel ischemic disease state, and then macrovascular diseases like strokes, coronary artery disease. When we look at our lab work, which we discussed in our previous month's conversation about creating awareness about our health status, when we look at our numbers and what our annual lab panels show, we'll see some of this dysfunction manifest as elevated triglyceride levels, either an elevated LDL, our bad cholesterol, or as a low HDL. And this has to do with compromise to the liver because of that excess fat storage. So we often are well aware when our cholesterol is elevated, but it can also be helpful to note, is your HDL or your healthy cholesterol lower than it should be? And again, this can just be one of many indicators that might prompt you to explore your metabolic status, and is nutrition or lack of nutrition contributing to a more unhealthy state for your cellular function. Okay, so we've now kind of gained hopefully an understanding of what our metabolism is, how we use food, how our body breaks down food and uses it as fuel. So then we want to take that next step and think, okay, so how can we then use that food as fuel to create health or to create a healthier environment at a cellular level, and then just at a more macro level of how we function day to day. And so before we explore that next phase, I'll invite each of you to take a quick break if you need to stand up, stretch, grab some water, use the bathroom, just take a minute to regroup, to stretch out any tissues that are starting to tighten up. Give yourself a little boost of energy, circulation. And so now we'll move into part two, which is really starting to create more awareness around our eating habits. So it's important that we examine our relationship with food, look at the structure. If we have structure, maybe we don't have any structure to our eating habits, considering food and how it ties into our circadian cycle, our 24-hour cycle. And then looking at general guiding principles around healthy eating habits. So one of the ways we can really get a better understanding of our eating habits and behaviors is to explore through a food log. So sometimes working with clients through my coaching sessions or even with clients that I'm seeing for physical therapy, if we think that nutrition is one of the driving factors in inflammation, in chronic pain, or is acting as a barrier to progress and to healing, then we'll take a deeper look at food intake, day-to-day intake, and try to gain a better understanding of what foods people tend to gravitate towards, what their eating habits are, what their behaviors are. This could be something that's done just for 1 or 2 days. You could do it over a week's time. It's really individual, person to person, but taking that time to put things into writing, it first and foremost just brings eating and nutrition and our habits back to the forefront where it's not that mindless practice, but it's something we're giving more thought and attention to. And then if we look along with the food log or food diary, we start to get a sense of what our eating schedule is. So on average, if you look at the literature, we're eating for about 15 hours of a day. 50% of our food intake often occurs after 4 p.m. However, we're most efficient at using food as energy during the day. So typically around like 1 to 2 p.m. So we want to think of this concept of what's called, in some of the studies, you'll see it referred to as chrononutrition. And that's recognizing that our body, it operates per circadian rhythm. So we're familiar with that from kind of our wake time is often synced with daylight. And then that triggers kind of hormone fluctuations. So cortisol initially low will then spike so that it's creating arousal and attention. So we're ready to take on the day. And then per our circadian cycle, we go through kind of these phases that then eventually, if operating efficiently and effectively, would lend to this then later in the day wind down phase and then hopefully sleep. And nutrition can be an important component that's either supporting our circadian cycle or disrupting our circadian cycle. So in the context of chrononutrition, we know that metabolism tends to peak between 10 and 2 p.m. We know that night eating syndrome is positively correlated to high body mass index, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. And people who sleep 5 hours on average, as opposed to the recommended 8 hours, interestingly, will consume about 22% greater calories the following day. So these are just subcomponents of chrononutrition, but it's really to demonstrate, one, that nutrition can affect our circadian rhythm, and two, there is often a direct link between our sleep cycle and our eating habits. That then in turn, both factors will indicate how amenable to healing or to stressors, how resilient our body systems are, all the way down to a tissue level. And in exploring our awareness with food, in addition to our schedule, the types of food choices we're making, it's also important to look at the behavior and kind of what's driving our choices or what's driving our need to eat. So it can be helpful to ask ourselves, are we really hungry? What are the drivers of our food choices? And this is often referred to as what's called food noise. So we can have emotional drivers, fatigue, boredom, low satiety. I'm just going to backtrack for a minute here. So I bet we could all kind of reflect even over just the last week's time, during times of increased stress, during times of elevated emotion, we will often gravitate towards food as a means of comfort. It can give us that instant gratification or feel good dopamine hit. And so we can gravitate towards that immediate resolution without recognizing kind of the harm that it's then contributing to. So, especially in the evening for many people, and this comes up a lot when I do my one-to-one coaching sessions, people will say they find themselves doing a lot of grazing, mindless snacking in the evening, and that's a time when we can often experience loneliness, when some of our other stressors are magnified because we're not engaged in daily activity that's keeping us distracted. Or we've kind of promoted a situation with poor food choices earlier in the day. And that's where low satiety would come in. So not really meeting our adequate protein intake, where by evening time, our body's craving an energy source, because we haven't kept up with the demands earlier in the day, really during the time when our body's more efficient at using and breaking down food as energy. This here just gives an example. Everyone has access to this. It's a free resource through the CDC as a food and beverage diary. So you could find that online easily if it's something that you wanted to keep track of. And then looking at your dietary components. So part of that awareness is really understanding what you are consuming, what the recommendations are, and then what is making up the food choices that you're selecting. So we have a recommended breakdown here of our protein, fat, and carbohydrate. And I just included an example of a nutrition label because I do think it's helpful. And you don't want to get obsessive about it, but in taking a look at what the nutrition labels are, they can give you a sense of how much added sugar, how much sodium, what's the saturated fat content, and protein intake. The other thing to look at is when you look at the ingredients, not just the breakdown of the micronutrients and macronutrients, but also looking at the components. So, do you see some of those emulsifiers, those chemicals listed as stabilizers, gums, that are contributing to the ultra processed nature of the food? So I think it's important to just be more mindful when we're making these choices. So in that runs the gamut of actually exploring the nutrition labels on the foods and then also exploring our own drivers to our choices, to our behaviors. So creating awareness and then keeping in mind that the pillars, which we'll continue to explore on a monthly basis, they all play off of one another. So like we were exploring earlier, diet can contribute to poor sleep or it can help optimize sleep. Poor sleep can contribute to stress. It can also contribute to unhealthy food choices the following day. Stress can contribute to poor food choices. Movement can either be fostered through appropriate fuel. Poor sleep, let's say, would have a detrimental effect on our desire for movement and physical activity the next day. So there's a large kind of cyclical interplay when it comes to our pillars. So if we optimize one, we're often optimizing the others as well. All right, we're going to take a minute or so here to just go through another movement stack. I want you guys to all start to get into that practice when you're doing prolonged sitting to incorporate some of these movements, get yourself up, stretch out, grab some water. And we'll come back here in a minute and spend these last 10 minutes just delving into the more practical action steps that you can take in terms of your day-to-day food choices. So I'll welcome everyone back. I hope you had a moment to move around a bit. And now we're going to jump into part 3, which is our practical strategies. So we discussed the consideration of food as fuel and how our body uses food as energy, and how our metabolism is derived from our food sources. And then we looked at part 2, which was creating more awareness around food, what food means to us, our food behaviors or habits that we tend to gravitate towards, getting a better understanding of those. And now part 3 is looking a little bit more at the practical strategies we can implement in terms of food choices. So how do we optimize our food selection? Do we go with elimination completely, or is there a way we can swap out for maybe a healthier option to foods? And then what does it mean to build a healthy plate, specifically protein, fiber, and fat content? I included a graphic here. The choosemyplate.gov is kind of replaced what we would think of as the food pyramid. So it's the new Drive federal agency that's helping to provide resources and education for optimal health and nutrition. So feel free to explore that website, choosemyplate.gov. They have a number of free resources, lots there to explore. If you're a visual person, it can help just looking at a lot of their graphics. All right, so when we look at our just practical strategies we can implement, the first thing we want to think about is how do we make food selection? So we want to look at the fewer ingredients, the better. So as close, remember that food matrix concept. The closer to the food in its original form it can be, the better. We want to shop the perimeters. So when you think about the layout of your grocery store, the perimeters are often your like meat, fish market, and then you have the produce, and then you get to the center of the store, and that's where we start to have aisles upon aisles of boxed and packaged and highly processed foods. So some of these simple strategies, we want to go for fewer ingredients, shopping the perimeter, and then staying mindful throughout the shopping process. And then as part of the staying mindful, I have started to develop a practice as somebody that has a sweet tooth and that can gravitate, especially during times of high stress, towards those unhealthy refined carbohydrates. I have found it helpful to ask the questions when I'm shopping is how can I use this food source to create health? Am I supporting my system or am I slowing it down? And then also, again, tuning into what's driving my food choice and just being aware, even in the active process of shopping and selecting food, about what those drivers are. And sometimes just these little questions in the moment can help foster a healthier choice when you would have tended to gravitate towards something more highly processed, highly palatable, that's going to give you that quick fix. And then in terms of taking action steps, the first thing we want to do is look at unprocessing your diet. So where do we tend to gravitate towards those highly processed foods, those foods that are high in added sugar, the ones that are going to put our body into that excess glucose state where then we end up storing much of that in form of fat and again, not that healthy fat, but that visceral fat that's often associated with cytokines and really increasing our inflammatory markers. So the first thing we want to do is that assessment of what does our food look like, what do we tend to gravitate towards, and how can we unprocess these choices. So in it kind of its most simplistic guiding principles, we want to reduce what are often considered our 4 white poisons, that's sugar, saturated fats, salt, and refined starches. And then we can look at replacing these items with more nutrient-dense options. So I think the 30-30-30 rule can be helpful. For each meal, you want to consume 30 grams of protein on average. Per day, you want to consume 30 grams of fiber. And then you'd like to incorporate at least 30 minutes of movement. I think it's important to note too how helpful movement can be in regulating our blood sugar immediately after we're eating food. So there's been a number of studies, and 2 of which just came out in the last month, indicating that movement after meals significantly decreases what's called our postprandial glucose level. And that's often in those 2 hours where we can see that really intense glucose spike, especially if we're eating things that are more refined and higher in the added sugar content. But doing something like a 10 to 15-minute walk, or even a couple of the studies looked at just body weight sit to stands, 15, 20 reps within a 15-minute window of eating had a significant positive effect on stabilizing our glucose after meal. When we look closer at protein, I think we often think of protein as something that builds muscle. And I hear in my cohort of, late 30s, early 40s, women especially will often say, well, I don't want to take too much protein because I don't want to bulk up. But it's also important to recognize that protein has a role in so many positive body processes, not just our ability to build muscle mass. It's used for tissue growth and repair. It's used to regulate hormones. It's used in enzyme production, which is crucial to our digestion process. It helps stabilize our blood sugar. So we now are all well aware of these GLP-1 agonists that are on the market. And their mechanism is to help regulate this process. And that's something that in a natural way protein is able to do. It's an important part of our immune function. So when we look at antibodies, they're proteins by nature, their makeup. And then as we discussed previously, through the process of thermogenesis, protein can contribute positively to our metabolism. And then protein, in the same sense, is the food source that will keep us full, and that feeling of satiety, more than any other food source. We look at fiber, which should be another component of our day-to-day intake. So going back to our 30-30-30 rule, we want to aim for about 30 grams of fiber per day. I'd say on average, Americans are getting 5 to 8 grams, so we're falling far below the recommended guidelines. And fiber can be broken up into two categories. So we have soluble fibers and then we have insoluble fibers. Now, keep in mind, I'm giving you very general guidelines. These recommendations are individualized based on each of your own health statuses. For example, if you're somebody that has a history of diverticulitis, irritable bowel syndrome, there would be circumstances where some of these recommendations would be catered towards the individual's needs. But in a general sense, when we're looking at our fibers, so you have your solubles, which are cholesterol lowering, blood sugar stabilizing. These fibers aid in digestion, and they help promote that good bacteria in our gut. They strengthen our intestinal lining, and maintaining that healthy gut barrier. So we hear a lot now, even in the context of some new understanding of neurodegenerative disease processes like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and a potential link to our microbiome, and looking at what's considered leaky gut syndrome or increased gut permeability, where fiber can really help strengthen our gut lining, so it's not as prone to having this weakened wall, where byproducts of our food, especially our ultra processed food, permeate that barrier and then make our way into the system where they're not intended to be. And then that's where they create oxidative stress, and that inflammation can really wreak havoc on our system at a cellular level. And then we have our insoluble fibers. And these are really what we look at in terms of like healthier digestion, keeping us regular in our bowel movements. And then last but not least, we want to think about our fats. So I think especially in the 90s and in the fad diets that came about, fats for a long time were really demonized. But we do know that healthy fats can be a really crucial part to our nutrition and again optimizing nutrition as fuel and as a means of building health, rather than something that's detracting from our health and wellness. So When looking at fats, you want to be able to differentiate between your saturated fats and your unsaturated fats. So, where we get into trouble in the standard American diet is high saturated fat intake. This is the bad fat, and you think of fats that are saturated tend to stay in solid form at room temperature. So you have like your butters, margarines, even your tropical oils, coconut oil. They're really high in saturated fat. Animal products, red meat, tend to be high in saturated fat. These fats raise our LDL cholesterol, so our bad cholesterol. Um, and then the the goal for intake really for healthy individuals less than 10%, and 5 to 6 for those with high cholesterol. So we would really want to keep that saturated fat intake on that low end of the spectrum. And that's where just being more attentive to your ingredient labels can help. And then we have our unsaturated fats. So this is where fat can be used as a healthy component of our diet. So we have monounsaturated fats, and our polyunsaturated fats. And these are ones you're probably familiar with as well. Our olive oil, avocados, seeds and nuts. These then lower our LDL cholesterol, so converse from our saturated fats. They can be really helpful in managing our cholesterol. And then we have our vegetable oils, our fatty fishes. Omega-3 is something that's gotten a lot of attention for brain health. That can come from fish, salmon, walnuts. So a lot of literature linking those polyunsaturated fats to healthy brain processes and protective mechanisms in the brain. One of the most helpful guidelines in terms of creating a healthy plate can be considering the makeup of a Mediterranean diet. And again, there's a number of resources available online. I'd also be happy to share if anyone's interested in further just concrete kind of physical um, visuals or charts or diagrams. Um, and then the Danish dietary guidelines, which were updated in 2021, they also have a lot of recommendations that are really in line with what we would consider optimizing our health status from a nutrition standpoint. So Mediterranean diet and Danish nutrition guidelines can be a good resource if you want to explore further. And additionally, if you are somebody that is kind of absorbing all this information, you may feel overwhelmed. That's totally understandable. It's a lot to process. If you do kind of draw a parallel between struggling with nutrition and some underlying health concerns, whether it's type 2 diabetes, maybe you had lab work done recently and you, for the first time, had an elevated A1C level. You're perhaps trending towards pre-diabetic state. Your cholesterol may be elevated. So this is where I offer some more of that individualized coaching that may be helpful to you. And then just in summary, our key takeaways from today's discussion, nutrition specific are being mindful of our choices, so creating that awareness first and foremost, trying to optimize your eating window, so limiting that late night eating and trying to keep it in that window of time where we're dispersing our food intake from, 10 to 4 p.m. rather than condensing most of it to post 4 p.m. hours. Aiming for more nutrient-dense food options, especially at breakfast, because if we think of that kind of syncing to our circadian cycle, that first meal of the day will then set us up for more success as the day goes on. We want to deprocess our food. So I really, when I work one-to-one with clients, the first step we take when we're kind of analyzing food choices is what things could be removed that fall into that high ultra processed category. And this does not have to be in the form of those extreme elimination diets. It's just looking at where is the majority of your highly processed food coming from or your added sugar intake coming from? And is that something you can consider at least cutting back on? So it's creating that awareness and then taking an action step. We want to look at where could we potentially swap our saturated fats for our healthy fats. So are there instances where we could use olive oil instead of butter, where we could perhaps use an avocado to substitute for a healthy fat versus um, something more sinister. And then, of course, we didn't delve into a lot of the beverage component today, but really making sure you're staying adequately hydrated, primarily getting that water intake throughout the day. Um, and then from a really broad standpoint, supporting your nutrition with the whole pillar approach. So like we discussed, they all interact with one another. So exercise, sleep health, stress management, and adequate socialization in a social support network can be helpful in both promoting better food choices and giving you the kind of support system and also that internal locus of control for making those choices. So that concludes the information. Please feel free to contact me if you have additional questions. I know, like I've said in previous conversations, it's a lot of information to process, but there are, real easy practical steps that you can implement right off the bat. So try to gravitate towards those small steps, and you want to think, one day at a time, one step at a time. So I thank you all for your time, both today and in our previous discussions. I will inform you that next month, so we will meet at the end of March to discuss Pillar 2, which will be our exercise and physical activity guidelines conversation. And in the meantime, if I can offer any support, please don't hesitate to contact me. I have my email listed here. And as I have done with our previous monthly meetings, I will send out as well as the video recording of today's lecture. I will adjunct with a PDF summary of information in text form. So I hope you're able to take some meaningful tips from today. Don't be a stranger, and just congratulations on being committed and taking this step towards optimizing your health.